Welcome to the latest installment of the Sharp Best Ball Pod, episode number 3. My name is Todd Burrows. You can find me on Twitter at BestBallNFL. And today I am joined by Rich Hribar, also of Sharp Football Analysis. And you can find him on Twitter at Lord Reeves. I did an article this week on how to leverage early best ball and to take advantage of uncertainty. And one area of uncertainty that you can take advantage of is by understanding team needs. Rich does a huge series for Sharp Football Analysis, team by team. It's an agonizing process from what I have seen. And a lot of them are already up on the sites. We'll have all of them up by the time the draft goes off. Rich is going to cover that with me today. I also hope you do check out the article. I talk a lot about how to leverage the uncertainty early with free agents and early and later up until draft day on the rookies, and why that is how you can get really great value. So check out the article. And now we get to the main part of the show. Rich, it is nice to have you on the show.
Yeah, Todd, it's great to be on with you. I've enjoyed the first 2 shows with Hayden and TJ. I will try to live up to the standards that they have set here, these opening 2 shows.
Yeah, A, I know you can. B, I know you will. And C, I know that they're good. And I'm excited that I've been able to start with such stellar guests for this series. So you've been doing the team needs articles for a while. Can you just take us through a little bit of your process and the things you consider when you're doing this exercise?
Yeah, I mean, it's all relatively easy, just looking at the rosters from a top-down stance, looking at, player performance, where teams are strong in terms of, actually having good players in context of the NFL. And then layering in some other things like, contractual depth, where teams need to kind of look for some maybe like potential, values. That's where you get like a lot of like late round picks, right? Like you're just trying to get, not necessarily trying to hit gems, but, kind of get like that contractual depth, have bodies that are signed. And then looking at kind of the current contracts that, players have and things that are coming up where teams might have to calibrate, like things like the Bengals, right? Like the Bengals are like an easy team to diagnose. They've got all these big contracts coming in the pipeline. How they draft over these next couple of years is going to be an inflection point based on kind of that. Joe Burrow is going to get a massive contract. T. Higgins will probably get at least a front-loaded, contract. Jamar Chase is coming. So it's really going to alter the way they attack certain positions in the draft too as well. So just kind of looking at all of those things, rolling it in together and kind of trying to use that as kind of a North Star in a sense to kind of say like, all right, well, this is the areas coming into this week and this weekend that, these teams are going to look at probably try to address some of these areas. Unfortunately, trying to just draft for need all doesn't work out for NFL teams because the hit rate is so low, especially as we move on through the rounds. But that's really all of it in a nutshell, is taking that 10,000 foot view of just really seeing where the rosters are in the landscape for all these teams.
Yep. And then if you're drafting, obviously what we're going to try and do is we're going to try and look at the available spots and who's likely to take players when they pick, and try and get a guess of where some of these guys might slot in. And, we've done a couple mock drafts here. I think everyone on Twitter is now tired of mock drafts and ready for the real draft. But what we can do is we can look at some of the really good spots, right? So, for instance, you use the Bengals. There's been rumors Joe Mixon might be asked to redo his contract. If he doesn't, he could go. So, based on that, we can say, all right, which guys are they likely to add here? Are they, do we think that they're going to add, or do we think that they're going to, just stick with what they have? And if to me, the Bengals obviously are a great landing spot for a running back. So trying to take some shots in drafts and earlier, if you know that a situation, maybe a free agent ends up there, you can end up getting some really good discounts, correct?
Oh yeah, always. And in this time of the year, especially pre-draft, not just for the rookies, but ambiguous situations from a top-down perspective are really great to take advantage of because players are drafting in best ball or drafting in fantasy leagues right now. Like no one likes uncertainty, right? Like so they'll avoid players that kind of come with that ambiguity. And Joe Mixon's one of those. So you can Joe Mixon could himself be a potential value. What if he does accept the pay cut, right? Like what if he does accept the pay cut, comes back?
And what if they don't sign it? They didn't get any free agents. In fact, they let his very successful backup go. And I've taken some shares of Mixon in the seventh round where I wasn't drafting him earlier, just kind of on a what if basis.
Yeah, on principle.
Yeah, you're going to want, even if you don't believe in guys, if you play in a lot of best ball leagues, you want to take shots on even guys where it doesn't look like a situation is going to work out in one way because it might work out in another way.
Yeah, I mean, you look at it just like using the Mixon example, like the Bengals are 26th in our analysis of draft value, like in terms of what they have to play with during this weekend in the draft. So, I mean, 25 teams have more draft capital than the Bengals. They don't really have a lot of it. So if they feel like, hey, we can either sign a veteran after the draft or we add some undrafted rookies and, Mr. Mixon accepts this pay cut, they could go in a number of different directions. But yeah, you always want to think about like those ranges of outcomes and where like current ADP is. It's not always about the player. It's about, where this guy could end up in August and where you can draft them now and where you can squeeze out just a little bit of those micro edges along the way.
One of the other areas that you can gain an edge sometimes by listening to and sometimes by avoiding is coach speak. How do you balance coach speak with the rest of your thought processes?
Yeah, I mean, it's not something I really hold in high regard, that and, team beat stuff, but, back in the days when I worked at NBC and, I didn't do a lot of blurbing, but, obviously I'm around all the guys and the process of how it gets done. And it's hard to find actionable stuff. Like you're looking for actual reporting and there's just not a lot of it. I mean, you get a lot of just kind of token responses from coaches. You don't get a lot of in-depth, actual actionable information, from those guys. You're trying to just sort through, look for some actual reporting to have some insights. I think you get a lot more looking how teams are handling like the pre-draft visits and stuff like that. I think that this time of year gives you a bigger signal than anything these coaches or GMs are saying right now, which is largely run-of-the-mill like responses that they've answered the same question 35 times this week probably. So, I might look at like, the team visit stuff because that gives you a better indication of where teams are going. You look at teams like Baltimore, Buffalo, the Cowboys, the Patriots, the Falcons. Those teams have like had the most wide receiver visits of any, types of class. It gives us a real indication like they're looking for players at these positions. The Giants, the Chiefs are right behind them. You look at a team like the Buccaneers, talking about an ambiguous situation. Rachaad White is kind of a guy like is a glass half full, glass half empty guy in these drafts right now because he can catch the ball. He was taken with some decent capital last year. He could be in line to be the bell cow running back. But you look at Tampa Bay, they've brought in both Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs, the top two running backs of this class, for visits, which kind of says like, oh, are they maybe not potentially sour on Rachaad White, but they want to add more to the position. The Denver Broncos have had more running backs in than any team so far. And that's not just because of Javonte Williams and his injury as part of it, but like you think about Sean Payton and when he was with the Saints, they always took running backs. They always added running backs throughout the course of the draft. That's a team that added Samaje Perine that we talked about with Joe Mixon. He's a guy that's getting drafted as kind of like a great like wide receiver heavy open. Like a lot of people are grabbing Samaje Perine because maybe early in the year he has a large runway. But what if he tumbles? Like if the Broncos add a guy like Jahmyr Gibbs, right, who kind of fits like Sean Payton style, that's going to sink a guy like Samaje Perine, even if he is in line to kind of be like the two down banger early in the season. All of those things you kind of look at. I think you get a lot more signal than you do out of any type of coach speak. Travis Etienne's another guy. The Jaguars have brought in a ton of running backs. They're looking at running backs. We know Travis Etienne's a guy that has flaws. Doug Peterson ties into the coach speak directly at that because, they've talked about, reducing Travis Etienne's workload. They don't want him to have the same workload he had last year, which was largely a byproduct of necessity on how the Jaguars had to operate last season. So I'm looking at more of that stuff than necessarily combing through and seeing what like these guys are really saying, because they're really not saying a whole lot of anything.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very good point. And the larger point is we do want to look for signals, and there's different ways to do that. Um, and sometimes, like with Rashad White, one signal is he just wasn't very efficient last year, right? There's a lot more metrics out there now that can give us key signals as well.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Rashad White, and it's not all his fault. I mean, the other thing that ties into his situation, if they say like Tampa Bay doesn't take a running back and they just roll in with like him, they added Chase Edmonds, is from a top-down stance, like the team is just bad. Like the offensive line is a disaster. We don't know if the quarterback play is going to provide anything functional. I mean, this is a team that was second to last in scoring in the NFC last year. Like already
with Tom Brady.
Right. Exactly.
I mean, it was end of career Tom Brady, but it was still Tom Brady. And, for me, from a perspective of, I do take some Mike Evans and Chris Godwin because, I think those guys are going to catch enough balls for their ADP, even in a bad situation. I think there's a floor there where you're taking them. But you do have this situation where certain teams just aren't very good, and it's better to avoid them. And that ties back into Rashad White. Some guys have a 3-down role and still don't give you a big edge in fantasy if the offense isn't very good.
Yeah, 100%. It's something I've harped on for years in fantasy. Like we don't have a lot of like true skeleton keys in fantasy football. We wouldn't have a game if they right. actually existed. But I am a harbinger of drafting guys on good teams, right? Like like the teams that score the most points are going to provide the most fantasy opportunity. I try to avoid teams that I believe are going to be bad. And I always do operate in the range of outcomes. And when you're doing something like best ball, when you're trying to like extend your portfolio a little bit and you're getting more, people like these shares of players. I mean, you might incorporate some of those guys. You might come underweight still, but you're not going to completely ignore guys as much in best ball as you will like in August when you're doing your redraft teams. But
because you're most likely only doing 3 to 5 redraft teams, where I'm going to have 600 best ball teams. If last year I had 600 best ball teams, it's a completely different dynamic. And it's one of the things, this podcast is both for people who are new to best ball as well as people like us who are pretty grounded in it. It's a completely different animal.
Yeah, so you're gonna pick and choose like we'll just use Rashad White as like the example for this point. Like if we're gonna be underweight on Rashad White, but we're still not gonna have 0% Rashad White, so we're gonna need to pick like of our best times to get in on him. Is it right now pre-draft where some teams might be saying like, oh, they brought in Gibbs, they brought in Robinson, they might be cool on him. So is he cheaper now, or is it going to be after the draft if they take one of those guys and he plummets, right? And he kind of takes a big time hit, and then does become more of a value then where an injury can open the door for him. Maybe he's just better than he was last year and is a better performer because sometimes like running back metrics aren't necessarily as sticky. They can be influenced by a number of other factors. So you've got to kind of try to balance that out. Well, if we're going to get in on Rashad White a little bit, is now the best time, or is it maybe in next week the best time to get in on?
Well, and again, the nature of best ball is there are two different things. You need one strategy for early best ball, and you need one strategy for later best ball because the contests end at the draft, right? So that is one time frame, and then there's another time frame. So to take what you're saying, a guy like Rashad White is a guy that I wanted to have ownership on because his price was pretty good, but it wasn't necessarily a guy that I felt the need to be 2x or 3x on, right? And when you read the article, you're going to see I give you 4 or 5 guys that I was buying real heavy, and they're rookies who were being taken 13th round and later, and free agents who were taken 13th round and later. And the reason was that uncertainty had driven their price down to the point to where if I'm wrong, it's not going to hurt me that much, right? Yeah. I'm not going to have terrible a terrible team if my 15th round, fifth running back sits on the bench, right? That team still has a chance. But a guy like Rachaad White, I might lock into somewhere between 6 and 12% ownership, where I'm either a little over or a little under, because he could go either way, and you're giving up draft capital. Does that make a decent amount of sense to you?
Oh yeah, 100%. I mean, it's always about cost, right? Like it's always going to be the driving force.
It's all about ADP, baby. I mean,
it's all about where you're paying, and especially like say when you're portfolio building. So like the timing of when you're going to be in on these guys is so important. And that's where the ebb and flow kind of changes in best ball versus some other formats, right? Like because it's always ever evolving. Whereas you're not going to draft your redraft teams until at the earliest, like early August, and everyone's mostly drafting like Labor Day weekend or after the preseason, right? So I mean, these best ball drafts, like you're following that constant wave of like where the news is going, and where kind of guys' prices are constantly shifting and altering, and kind of when do you want to get in? Do you want to get in high? Do you want to get in low? Or what you believe is high and low, and all those things. So that's what's really kind of the main catalyst for best ball.
Yeah, I agree completely, and you want to try and balance on each team your uncertainty. So, for me, this is one of the things I don't hear much talked about much. I don't want 6 or 7 guys on one team that all have uncertainty, but I do want at least 2 or 3 players in each draft that have uncertainty. It's kind of, I always use the example of a mixed drink, right? If you don't have enough alcohol in it, the drink is worthless, right? If you have too much alcohol in the drink, it's not good either. You want to have that right amount of alcohol to where you have a good time and you also get where you're trying to go. I feel that way about risk and uncertainty. Do you like that explanation?
Yeah. I'm generally a more pragmatic, fantasy player by nature anyways. I'm largely risk averse, but I mean, I definitely have like specific archetypes I look for. And always, like I said, I'm always thinking like range of outcomes. I might not have a lot of conviction on a player, but it's easy to spot like the upside a player may have, right? So if he's going at a certain point of a draft where I'm like, oh, well, this is not being fully priced in, like his upside range of outcomes, like I want to get in on this player. I'm going to go ahead and do that and add those to teams, but they're probably going to be teams, like you said, where I started more initially with the draft with more like stability where I could take that on. It's like, wow, if this guy does hit this higher end range of outcomes, like it's going to take this team from being what I believe is really solid and has a high floor and high upside to just being able to potentially shatter like the ceiling it has.
Yeah, that's exactly how I feel. So one situation I wanted to get your thoughts on is the Minnesota running back situation. It's one of the key ones to try and get right now. Dalvin Cooks still on the roster. They re-signed Alexander Mattison for a pretty good sized contract, more than you would typically give to a strictly backup. They didn't give him that much work last year. It wasn't like the situation with the previous management team there. Are you of the opinion of, hey, I want a lot of Alexander Mattison right now, or the uncertainty has also affected Dalvin Cook's ADP, where he could perform whether he's with Minnesota or not? Do you like one of them, both of them, or none of them?
Yeah, I think they both fit specific builds based on who you drafted. I think Dalvin Cook right now is largely undervalued for a couple reasons. Well, one, the big talk is like restructure, right? And we don't know what that means. We don't know what they're asking him to take in terms of a pay cut, but like he's really like an outright tough cut in terms of what he has left on his contract in terms of dead money. I mean, he currently has a $14 million cap hit this season, but he's $8.2 million in dead money. Like, is that $6 million really getting them anything this season? Like, is it really restricting them? Probably not right now. And after June 1, it could be up to $9 million, but that's only an extra $800K. So, I mean, I think that he's probably early signals point to me that like he's probably still going to be a Viking, or it's better odds than the public thinks of still being with the Vikings next year.
I agree.
And then he also was really good last year, the first 2 months of the season. And then the Vikings offensive line like outright imploded. So the final 9 games of the season, the Minnesota Vikings only had Brian O'Neill, Garrett Bradbury, and Christian Darrisaw on the field for 17 snaps total. Those three guys played 17 snaps together. And when those three guys were in the lineup, Dalvin Cook averaged 5.1 yards per carry. He had a 38% success rate, 3.8 yards after contact per carry. 13% of his runs gained 10 or more yardage. And when those guys were all out of the lineup, everything cratered. 3.8 yards per carry, 30.6% success rate. Only 8.2% of his runs went for 10 or more yards. Just everything dropped off. So is that necessarily like a Dalvin Cook performance issue? Maybe, because you say, like, yeah, great players can overcome, but also no one was running behind this offensive line. You look at Alexander Mattison too. He's been good when the Vikings have had to give him a lot of touches the past years, and somehow he always seemingly starts against the Detroit Lions. Like somehow all of his starts end up against the Lions. But Alexander Madison's been outright really bad the past 2 years. I mean, the past 2 years, there's 74 running backs that have 100 or more carries. He's 68th in yards per carry, 45th in success rate, 43rd in explosive run rate, 42nd in yards after contact per carry. This is a guy that hasn't been very good outside of just volume, which we understand from fantasy, like volume's the catalyst for running backs. But it's like, if you're not better than the volume you're getting, how good are you really longevity of holding on to that volume, right? That's what we talked about.
That is exactly how I think about it, right? You know, I want talented guys because, you know, like a perfect example a couple years ago, who was the guy who had, his last name was Davis. He was in Atlanta, and he had been in Mike Davis, right? And he had a couple big games in Carolina, and he ended up in Atlanta, and the whole assumption was, well, there's nobody else. And you find guys who don't play well, they find someone else, right?
Right.
You know, you know, on one hand, everyone says running backs don't matter, but in the next breath, certain people will tell you, well, he's the only guy who's there, right? And I tend to avoid those situations. Maybe not completely. Again, it depends on ADP. But Mike Davis a couple years ago in the 5th round was a guy I don't think I took once, right? In 500 drafts. I just didn't see the upside, and I saw a lot of downside. I agree on Mattison that, you know, I keep hearing on Twitter, and the hardest thing for me, Rich, in fantasy is hearing from people you do respect things that go against what you're thinking, right? It's easy to get it's easy to get pushed by people. You know, if someone you don't respect tells you something, you go, you know. But if someone you do respect is saying, get Alexander Mattison now, he's going to be going in the 5th round in, you know, once Dalvin Cook gets cut. I mean, that's harder to resist.
Yeah, I mean, this is always the toughest thing in fantasy, especially from my end. Someone that's been in the, you know, not just in the industry doing projections and, you know, putting out content for consumers, but because I want people to follow how I'm playing the game. I always try to put out advice of like, this is how I'm playing it. So if you want to follow it, like, we're going to sink or swim together. And it's hard when you hear that echo chamber. Last year, you know, I did early projections and I was really down on Courtland Sutton, right? I was like, ooh, Courtland Sutton's not really popping for me. This is a player that I kind of believe is overvalued as a real football player. And then like the echo chamber just kept like going, like, man, Courtland Sutton's going to have a huge year. And then, you know, you start to hear it from so many people you respect and you start bumping them up the rankings a little bit.
Right.
And you start nudging them up. And then it comes out and you're like sitting here in week 8 and you look at Courtland Sutton, like, you're like, damn it, I didn't really believe in this player anyways. And, you know, I kind of got influenced and kind of.
And that's the worst. The worst, you know, like if I really believe in a guy and he bombs, I never have a problem with that, right? I can use it as a learning, you know, if nothing else, it can be a learning experience of, well, why did I miss? But where I just sit there and literally want to bash my head against the wall is when my initial instinct was correct and I let someone else change my mind. And that is, you know,
it's hard to not be influenced though, especially when there's so many smart people here and there's so much data and everyone's combing through all these things. And you're bringing up, even someone might bring up a great point, right? Like it's a great point that they're bringing up.
Right.
But yeah, it's hard to avoid it, especially because we're going to be talking about these players from now post draft and we know these landing spots literally for 5 months. So it's hard not to let some of that creep into your brain.
June, July is the worst time to draft because or it can be good too, but because there isn't any real news,
Yes.
we see player moves that are based really on nothing other than everyone's bored. And, so we decided that this guy wasn't good anymore, or that guy is great all of a sudden. And, by resisting those kind of moves. Now, the other side of that is I've also shut off things I shouldn't shut off, right? Because you do want to be open to having your mind changed. And
Mhm.
so all the more
Of
for
course.
me, I focused on, I want to I've started going back and watching a lot more tape. I want to see it, right? I know I don't want to avoid numbers, but I don't want to just go by numbers and I don't want to go by tape. But if I think I'm missing something, I really want to go back and, like with Cortland Sutton, I avoided him last year. I barely have any this year. I just don't see the guy getting open, right? When I watch the game and I've played him in daily fantasy, I'm always like, why aren't they throwing to him? And then I'm watching him and I'm like, he ain't open, right? Um, it ties back into your good teams conversation. We also want to draft good players.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. If so, like an example of a guy right now that's like at a really tough inflection point, I believe is TJ Hockenson, right? Especially when you're talking about not underdog, but on FFPC, where
Okay.
he's going in like the third round because
And he was going mid-second in early drafts.
right. So TJ Hockenson is a guy we know that there's a perception that he's talented. He was the 7th overall pick of the draft, but so far in the NFL, there's nothing that stands out from him that he's actually like an above like really baseline player. Like absolutely nothing shows that he is. But then he goes to Minnesota last year and he says like all this buckets of volume that drives him. And the situation really hasn't changed for him. And maybe it changes on Thursday if the Vikings take a first round wide receiver. But like the Vikings haven't really added anything. So you're like, all right, he can easily run this back. But what if the Vikings have a better run game, like we talked about? What if those 3 linemen are healthy and they run the football better? What if their defense just isn't the worst defense in the NFL over the back half of the season and they don't play in as many like crazy shootouts and the volume just kind of gets reduced that way? Is he a guy that is going to let down at his ADP, especially at a position like tight end where like it's easy to miss big at tight end? Especially in the early rounds. Like not Travis Kelce's been like the one Gibraltar, but like we've all got some really bad tight end picks on our ledger, especially in FFPC.
Oh, absolutely. And FFPC is where most of my money goes, right? Because each best ball draft is $125
Yep.
versus underdog
Yeah.
that's 5 or 25.
Yep.
It adds up quick. And I did 60 solo last year and just in the late best ball. So yeah, the other thing that
You always want to start with player though first. I believe the biggest trap, like I said, we don't have a lot of skeleton keys, but if the argument you're making for a player selection starts with situation and not the player himself, I think you're already going down the wrong road.
I agree.
You're already moving yourself into an area where it takes. Dalton Schultz was a guy like this last year, right? Like everyone brought up Dalton Schultz, and no one ever started the argument with Dalton Schultz the player. No one ever told you anything about Dalton Schultz the player. It was always about a situation, and that's like an immediate red flag for me when it's like that for a player. So
and now he's like 4 or 5 rounds later, where you look and you say, he is open, right? I mean, he's a guy. When I watch the Cowboys, that he's open. I still am having a hard time taking him at his current ADP. Let's go to the quarterback position for a minute, because we're all interested in the rookie quarterbacks. So as we head into and then out of the draft, the most conversation seemed to be on the quarterback position, but historically the rookie QBs can struggle. Yeah. Of the teams you have reviewed that need quarterbacks, what spots are you most excited to see a quarterback land, and which spots seem troublesome even if a good rookie quarterback lands there?
Yeah, I mean, it's always tough because these teams that typically have these draft picks where these immense talents go, they're there for a reason, right? Like, you once in a while get a situation where a couple years the 49ers trade into pick 3 or the Chiefs move up and they take Mahomes, but it's not like any of those guys provided like rookie value anyways. But typically these teams are picking here because they're bad and they're taking these players. So I mean, you look at both teams, Carolina and Houston, 1-2. There is a great squint and see it situation with Carolina, but there's also like a huge signal. Like this is a team that's going to have they have a really good young defense, and they've got a really good offensive line. They've got Doug Peterson. They signed Miles Sanders. Like this is a team that's giving you a huge signal. Like they're going to try to run the ball and play defense in 2023. They have Adam Thielen and DJ Shark and Terrace Marshall. Like this is and Hayden Hurst. Like this is not a team that's probably looking to drop back like 600 times at the rookie quarterback.
No.
And they might be in a position where they don't have to be because their defense is good enough. They're in the right division. All these things kind of line up to where they can play some kind of bully ball and get away. Houston just is structurally like a nightmare. Like there's really nothing. There's really no signal the Texans have given us the past 3 years that shows like what direction they haven't tipped their hand into like what direction they're trying to do. This team is like really just devoid of talent.
Nobody loves washed up vets. For a team that's rebuilding, nobody loves washed up vets more than the Texans.
Yeah, I've always made the correlate. If you saw the movie like Major League and like how like they were trying to build the team in that, like just like sign guys to 1-year contracts. Like most of these guys didn't even have a career. Like this guy's dead. That's like what the Texans have done for 3 years. Just like just sign.
Yeah, and now you're hearing they might not take the quarterback. I mean, I don't get great signals from them.
Yeah, it's very tough. I would say like the teams that you're probably looking at largely to maybe be kind of wild cards, like, Tampa Bay has like some weapons, right? Like they've got some good players and some players that are talented, and they probably are going to a team that's going to have to throw a little bit more. If Washington would get in the quarterback race, like they're clearly a team, like if a quarterback would fall there, like their team. Seattle is another one of those teams. Like what if Geno Smith really wasn't strong the last 8 games of the year last year? What if they take a quarterback back at 6? Like then there's pressure to play that guy earlier if Geno struggles, right? They've got really nice players and surrounding offensive talent. But a lot of these spots are bad that you look at, Tennessee. We want anybody that's going to Tennessee. It's rough, man. It's just really rough out there. The Colts are another roster that's just really hurting. Like there's just not a lot of talent there. You're hoping that Shane Steichen can kind of bring some of what he had with Jonathan Gannon and the Eagles, but like the infrastructure is just not as good. This is a significantly worse team than what they had in Philadelphia. And
at
then
least they have some weapons.
They do.
At least Pittman. I think Pittman's a player, and we know Jonathan Taylor can be a player. And I may own more Jelani Woods than drafts.
I like that. I like Jelani.
Yeah,
I mean, the right division too.
Whenever you can get a guy that you could at least see being a top 5 tight end in the 17th, 18th round of even FFPC drafts, that's something that I'm always going to be pretty interested in. For me, that takes the conversation over to something well, the Konami code. And when I draft rookie quarterbacks, a lot of times I want them to have that running floor. And I think a lot of people assume that running quarterbacks have big ceilings, but what the running does is it gives them a good floor. Mm-hmm. In other words, even if they have a bad passing game, they can give you 12 to 15 points because they run for 60, 70 yards. And it also brings us to one of the most controversial people in the draft, AR-15, Mr. Richardson. What are your thoughts on him and his ADP? And then the last thing I'll throw out is I think the Raiders are probably the spot where I'd like to see a rookie quarterback go. I was a big Jimmy G guy, but those days have passed. And whether it's Herndon Hooker or Richardson, both guys can run. I would have a significant amount of interest in either of them if they ended up with the Raiders.
Yeah, so Anthony Richardson, rookie quarterbacks in general are just it's tough because they struggle. But at least with Anthony Richardson, you can find a path to say how he can be fantasy relevant just through his legs alone. What you're worried about with him from a best ball stance, though, is does he even play as a rookie? And how many starts do you get out of him? If he ends up being a top 10 pick, it's going to be hard to keep him off the field, especially on a team that's relatively has a shot to not be good. If a team, even like say like the Lions, right? Like a team believe like, oh, well, Jared Goff, he can sit behind there. But if the Lions, who have real expectations this year, start off like 2-5, right? Or like 2-4 even. And like people are like, oh, Goff's like kind of playing out his career. Like we need to like they're just gonna hear about like, well, you took a kid this early in the draft, like he's got to play. And if you look at quarterbacks, they play early because of this.
Right.
These coaches and these GMs, they have shot clocks now, internal shot clocks. And like, we got to kind of see what these guys can do. And no one really sits anymore. Mahomes and Trey Lance are like the only two guys that have really sat in the last basically decade. And like, then you have to go all the way back to like Jake Locker as like the only guy that like had tangible capital in the first round and didn't play as a rookie because of those reasons, because these teams always hear it eventually. Like, well, you put all this money into this guy turning the franchise around. We're not good. Let's get this guy on the field, start playing him.
Yeah, because most of these coaches and GMs are on a 3-year clock, unless you're Nick Caserio and you puzzlingly don't know what you're doing in Houston. Bijan Robinson is the big name at running back, and our mock draft expert, Ryan McChrystal, has him going to Buffalo, but there's a lot of talk of him going much earlier than that. Where would you like to see him land? He already has a late early second round ADP.
Yeah, it's interesting because anytime we were talking about this with Dan Pizzuta on our show last week, and kind of wondering like, is a team going to reach into the cookie jar earlier than expected, or has there been enough signal to where like he's probably going to go like maybe mid to late first? Like we know he's going to go in the first round, but where and how high can he go? We haven't seen a running back go, extremely high since Saquon. Everyone else, but we also haven't had a guy that's like really thought of as like being that kind of elite talent like Bijan is. I mean, you look at a lot of people's like big boards from a talent perspective, he's like 2 or 3 in terms of just like raw talent in this draft, but he's never mock draft there too. So it's like, who's going to like reach in? Is it going to be Atlanta? Is it going to be Tampa Bay? One of these teams. But I mean, obviously we would love to see him kind of go to one of these good offenses like Cincinnati, right? Like if he was to go to Cincinnati, then obviously that pushes like the door down. We'd love to see him end up with Philadelphia. If he ended up in Atlanta too, that'd be really good from a fantasy stance because of just how good that scheme is. But those are kind of like the obvious spots. It really matters though, like kind of how early is he going to go? Because it's hard to, when you like do mock drafts or kind of find a spot for him, like no one really has a clear need for him. Like you're looking at like the first like top 20 picks, 25 picks. No one really does. I mean, Atlanta and Philadelphia have both shown that they can get a lot out of running backs that are just like baseline level. And why reach with that much capital when this class is good enough to where they can add guys on day 2 and day 3 to their depth and be really good and get a lot of production out of those players. You look at a team like maybe the Chargers, I think makes a lot of sense. I wouldn't do it if I was the Chargers, but makes sense for their situation. You've got Austin Eckler in the contract schism. He wants to get paid like a front end running back. He's 28 years old. He's also a guy that openly doesn't want to have a lot of touches and they want to reduce his touches. They've got a quarterback on a rookie contract. They also have the perception of believing they have a really good offense. So like adding another piece, I could see them maybe talk themselves down to that lane, but like, it's really hard to find a team that absolutely says like, yeah, he would go here and he's like a clear need for this team.
Yeah. I think if he makes it past 10, then Dallas is on the clock, right? I think once, whether they should or shouldn't, doesn't matter with Jerry Jones. I think once he gets to the point where they can trade up without selling the farm, I think you have to consider Dallas as a place where he might end up. Zamir Gibbs and Zach Charbonnet are the next 2 quarterbacks off the board at ADP early. I've avoided Gibbs where he is going. Like, he's going around where Dalvin and Aaron Jones go. Yeah. And I've just mixed in Charbonnet in the 8th, 9th, 10th round. Any thoughts on these two and where you'd like to see them go?
Yeah, Gibbs, I think, is really hard from a fantasy stance because he's a smaller back. He's sub 200 pounds. And typically these guys, when they come with draft capital in fantasy football, they're largely busts anyways. You need a guy to run into like the Austin Eckler run out, right? And it took Austin Eckler years to like Austin Eckler had to have years of efficiency to show that he was just too damn good to take off the field. And even then, they don't want him to have as many touches as he's had the last 2 years.
Tony Pollard's another example.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Gibbs, a lot of people comp him to Alvin Kamara, but he's 15 pounds lighter than Alvin Kamara was when Alvin Kamara was at the combine. That's significant for NFL head coaches. Like, they have a hard time giving these like compact guys just a ton of touches. And then Gibbs himself, like how Alabama used him, was kind of like really tried and true, and like how he's probably going to be used out of the box in the NFL. Just 25% of his carries were inside runs. That was the lowest rate in this class. When he was hit at or behind the line of scrimmage, he averaged less than a yard per carry. He had the third lowest rate of yards per carry on those carries in this class. They pulled him at the goal line. He only had 3 of the 16 running back touches that the Alabama running backs had. And those are all things that matter in fantasy football, because those are things that limit your ceiling.
Absolutely.
Like, we want guys to get the money touches. So he's a guy at his price point. To take him over proven good players that have extended workloads is just really hard. Like, you're really giving yourself thin margins for return on
I'm
that.
glad to hear you say that, considering how little I mean, I don't know that I have a share.
Yeah, it's really tough there. I would say like, a spot to where I think he makes a lot of sense would be a team we talked about, like Denver, right? And not just making the Alvin Kamara, Sean Payton corollary, but like, he fits there. Russell Wilson threw to his running backs the 5th highest rate last season. They just weren't any good in the passing game. So I do think he does make sense there based on kind of what they have early in the season with P. Ryan, waiting for Javonte Williams to come back, and then what that scheme and quarterback does. He does make a lot of sense there.
Yeah, I feel like I saw a rumor about him in Miami. And
but Miami has no draft picks, so that's the toughest thing.
The guy that I'd like to see in Miami is Devin Achane. That real one cut guy with just jets, right? All he has to do is make that one cut and go. I'd like to see Devin Achane end up in Miami in the 2nd round.
Yeah, the Dolphins are one of these people, like, you always see like teams like, what's one of these great spots for running back? And everyone brings up the Dolphins. Like, the Dolphins have 4 draft picks. And if they're using 1 on a running back,
yeah, that's fair.
It's tough.
More likely they'll be in the Dalvin Cook sweepstakes if Dalvin gets cut.
Yeah, 100%. That would be the avenue. But they only have 4 draft picks, and it's tough to really say, like, when we have this much limited capital, because they have 2 picks on day 2, they have pick 51 and pick 84. And to use either one of those on a running back, given some of their needs, especially on the offensive line, I mean, it's tough. It's tough to say like they're making the right choice, because both Mostert and Jeff Wilson were functional players last year. Like, they can roll those guys out for another year and still have a functional, serviceable running game, especially that Mike McDaniel running game. Then taking one of those guys with pick 51 and pick 84, it's a running back.
Yeah, I'd love to see Tajay Spears if he drops, right?
Abanaconda's another guy, because he's like mini Raheem Mostert. Like, all his runs in college were outside zone runs. You give him a tarmac, he's gonna. I
love him, but if you breathe on him, he falls down.
Oh yeah, if you asking him to break a tackle, it ain't happening.
No, and I was I think I have 30% Israel. But he was going in the 19th, 20th round on underdog for most of the offseason. That's where I'm willing to take a chance on a guy like that. Now he's kind of going in like the 13th round. No, thank you. I'll wait. Wide receiver, very polarizing this year, Rich. Any favorites that you have? And what are your thoughts on JSN as the number 1 guy?
Yeah, I think it's pretty clear that he's in kind of like a little bit mini tier by himself. The question of JSN from a fantasy stance is, how tight is the margin of, does he have a ceiling that's Amon-Ra St. Brown like, or can he get to like that Cooper Kupp level? We just didn't see him play a lot outside. We're projecting, and we believe he can, that there's talent there. I mean, this guy is immense pedigree as a 5-star recruit, but he ran just 15 total pass routes over 3 years at Ohio State with 2 or fewer wide receivers on the field. 95 of his 110 career catches came out of the slot. So it still does take a lot of projection. If he ends up like Keenan Allen or Amon-Ra St. Brown, that's good still. That's really good. But is it like gonna like tilt and win like a league for you? Can he get the Justin Jefferson range of outcomes, the Jamar Chase range of outcomes as a rookie? Be one of those guys that like has a tide turning season for you as a rookie. So it's going to be probably landing spot dependent where he goes in terms of target share, is what kind of quarterback play is he have, what kind of system is he in, because his style of play, especially coming out of the box, lends itself to that, especially with the NFL now. I mean, we see the NFL, they're not playing very much man coverage anymore. They're not blitzing a lot. You're getting a lot of that too high safeties. I always joke, like my grandma knows what too high safety is now because she's heard it over the past 2 years so many times. And he's going to thrive in like that area. I mean, the NFL is really like a yak space game now. And that's where he's going to be really good out of the box. So we want him to land with a functional scheme and functional quarterback play right away.
The most polarizing wide receiver in the draft is Quentin Johnston. I happen to like him. I was not drafting him early, but now I see him dropping into the 10th, 11th rounds of drafts. That's where I'm willing to take some shots on a talented guy who definitely has some flaws in his game.
He's an interesting player too, for sure, because, you know, he's kind of like, everyone sees the glass half full, the glass half empty. But what we just talked about, JSN, I think it actually helps Quentin Johnston, because one of the things is he is bigger than the other guys at the top of this class, but he plays like a little bit of a smaller game. He's more of a good guy that's going to get like into space, break tackles, and is really great after the catch. And that's kind of what's really good in the NFL right now. So I think that gives him a little bit more upside where people kind of pick away. Like, he might not be a true alpha in the sense of winning contested catches and winning these 50-50 balls and playing down to a size, as some people say. But with what's really good in the NFL, I think gives him an avenue to kind of hone like the best of his craft. So, you know, if he's in the back of the first round, which a lot of people have had him go out, but you look at some of these teams picking back there that are running like a shorter passing game, like the Minnesota Vikings, right? Our team, he can slot in against Justin Jefferson and just kind of clean up a lot of stuff there. The New York Giants are a team that have a really shallow passing game and rely on
I would love.
Oh, so you are a Giants.
I'm a Giant fan.
And then the obvious one is the Chiefs, right? Because the Chiefs had, with them moving Tyreek Hill last year, really changed their approach to offense. They had Patrick Mahomes at his lowest 8 out of his career. 56% of his passing yards came after the catch last year, which is the highest rate, and that was 7th in the NFL. Like, he kind of really fits that too, where he can be one of those guys there too. So that back first, I still think gives him some landing spots that make him pretty interesting.
Yeah, I agree, and there's a lot of guys like that. All right, let's just really ask you this, and then we'll get out of here. Based on your team needs study, is there any teams that you think might surprise this year? In other words, a couple years ago, the Bengals, you know, they had Joe Burrow, they had Jamar Chase 2 years ago, and they were, you know, by hindsight, they were really cheap. Now, you know, is there a team out? Okay, let me put it this way. What are the 2 or 3 teams you think are most likely to take that next step where the guys are cheap, but they could be someone we're talking about as a top offense next year?
Yeah, it's interesting because obviously if you have this like, you know, kind of, you know, clarity, like, you know, saying like, oh, the Bengals are make this jump, it's like you're going to make oodles of money, but it's tough to land those kind of those spots and stick that plane. I don't like a couple of teams that I definitely think are better than people believe. But one is the Browns for sure. I mean, this is a team that probably was 2 kind of fluky plays away from making the playoffs last year. They're not necessarily cheap, but I do think that their top guys are underpriced. I think Nick Chubb is underpriced, especially right now in early drafts, because everyone's taking wide receivers heavy. Maybe he'll climb as the summer goes on. But Nick Chubb, if you look at like what Kevin Stefanski did last year, he had his highest rate of runs against light boxes. He had the most runs with 3 or more wide receivers on the field of his career. They lost Kareem Hunt, and people don't kind of realize like Nick Chubb was like a kind of a true workhorse last year. The depth isn't really good there. Maybe they add it back, but probably no one nearly as good as Kareem Hunt was, even though he was kind of like a ghost of himself last year. Amari Cooper is always kind of perpetually undervalued. I think Deshaun Watson, by the time we get to August, will climb because he's the next guy after you hit that firewall of quarterbacks that
Yep.
is the archetype of what you look for, a guy that can be mobile and definitely has passing upside too as well. I don't love this team because I don't like the system they run, but I will say like all their players are cheap enough and they're talented enough to where maybe you can talk yourself into the Steelers guys having a season that's just better than we believe it can be. Because the guy, like from a talent perspective, like they have enough talent in the range of outcomes. Like there's a range of outcomes where Kenny Pickett's actually good. There's a range of outcomes where George Pickens is actually good. We've seen Deontay Johnson play better than he was last year. We know Pat Freiermuth is the talented player. We know Najee Harris is at least potentially talented. And Jaylen Warren's the opposite of what we talked about with Alexander Mattison. Like Jaylen Warren was a really good player that didn't get a lot of touches last year, but he was really good at the touches he got. So like he fits me more as like the 0 RB kind of guy. Like I want to take a shot on. So I don't love Matt Canada. I kind of hate what they do on offense. I'm not high on Kenny Pickett, but like there is a range of outcomes where I have to tell myself internally, like, there's enough talent here to be better than I believe it is right now coming off of last year.
Got it. Well, I love the Browns call. My two most owned quarterbacks are Dak and Deshaun Watson for the exact reason you mentioned. I want, historically that second tier, right, past the firewall, you get one guy who ends up being a top 3 quarterback, right? Whether it's Russell Wilson one year or Dak another year. You do, and last year that tier just completely died, right? Stafford was awful. Dak got hurt and then wasn't very good. And I think Watson is so cheap because he came back and looked so terrible. I think people are having a hard time rationalizing why he was that bad, so they're assuming he is that bad. But I feel like he can be what he was. The other team I'll throw out, and I'd love your thoughts, and that'll end it, is I think the Bears can take a step.
Yeah, the Bears, I mean, it all comes down to really Justin Fields' true growth. And I had a thread on this this week, not necessarily on Justin Fields, but top down on just how important, sacks are on an NFL drive and kind of the influx, because I was talking about Anthony Richardson, who is, from a college perspective, elite at avoiding sacks. And there's this great thread you can read on. I have all the data, like last 5 years of, the drive performance for NFL teams when they do and don't take sacks. And this is a problem Justin Fields has had going all the way back to Ohio State. He was one of the worst quarterbacks at avoiding pressures into sacks. And through 2 years in the NFL, he's been historically bad. Last year, he set the record for sack rate for any quarterback in an NFL season. It's not the accuracy stuff with Justin Fields. It's can he avoid the crippling sacks and loss of plays. From a fantasy stance, it's going to be largely fine because he runs around. Although I will say at his cost, there's some risk there because now that he's really expensive, he's the kind of guy you bet on where he had the cost of last year and kind of question the cost that he has this year because he has to make so much growth still. But there definitely is a range of outcomes where this all comes together like it did for the Eagles in a sense. Like they probably won't be as good as the Eagles. I ain't putting the Bears in the Super Bowl, but we're adding DJ Moore, like it was, Josh Allen getting Stephon Diggs, Jalen Hurts getting AJ Brown. Like this all could help him, but he's gotta do better job at avoiding sacks.
Yeah, I like that. I think that if you just look at the games where they took the leash off after, I think it was week 5, he was right there with the other top 3 quarterbacks in fantasy points above average. And I do think his arm is better. And because he does run around, you end up getting bigger plays because of, all of a sudden Cole Kmet's wide open 40 yards downfield. So I was buying a lot of Fields when he started dropping right before the DJ Moore trade. He was dropping into kind of Lamar Jackson, Trevor Lawrence range a little bit. Now he's back in the 3rd round, and I take a little because I want access to 40-point weeks because in these best ball tournaments, that can win you a tremendous amount of money, right? That, the guy who can get you that 40-point week. So I appreciate you coming on and your support for this podcast. I hope to have you on again soon. Any last thing you want people to look out for?
Nothing in particular. It's just kind of a great week, right? Like we've we're all tired of the hot takes and the kind of everything going on leading to the draft. All the hearsay, the new the testing that they're giving quarterbacks, like all these things finally don't matter on Thursday night, right? Like it's at was it 7 or 8 o'clock Eastern? We're going to actually have players selected and going to places. We're not going to have to deal with this. And we're going to have another wave turn in kind of these best ball drafts. Come when you draft immediately on Friday morning, there's going to be different. There's going to be a difference in ADP for specific players. It's going to not just change the ADP for those players, but other players. And I'm really looking forward to this next kind of bridge of the season.
I agree. And it's one of my favorite times to draft because the ADP doesn't update on the site for like a week or two.
Yeah.
So you can gain a lot of edge. And then people really haven't done the right analysis, and you can gain a little bit of edge. But we will be back next week. We'll probably cover the underdog tournament that's been released. FFPC has already released the details of their big tournament, which didn't change much from last year, which I'm happy about. That's going to do it for this week. Again, thank you, Rich Hribar, for coming on and joining us, and we will see you next week.